Since October 7th, the world has been littered with horrific images from the attack by the terrorist group Hamas on unsuspecting Israelis. The pushback from Israel has been strident and expanding. In the middle are 5 million Palestinians who have seen destruction of their homes as Israeli military pursue Hamas. While the violence is half a world away from Canada, there has been a huge uptick in violence and anti-Semitism here. Our unpublished vote question asked, do you feel police in Canada are addressing the violence and anti-Semitism professionally? Yes, no, or unsure. You can cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote. Don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a one-year membership to unpublished.ca. You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. Joining us to discuss the increase in violence and hate is Warren Kinsella, political commentator, former special advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien, as well, an author. And Warren, I've known you for quite a while, and I've never seen your concern so pronounced regarding the Israeli-Hamas war. Why is that?
Well, you and I have known each other for a long time. And, as you know, I've been writing about this stuff, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and racism for more than 30 years. I've written 10 books. Most of them are about those subjects. And, it's always bad. Like there's no region, there's no province that's got a monopoly over virtue. The issue of anti-Semitism and that kind of hatred never fully ever goes away. But I've never seen it as organized and as brazen and as bold and as out there as it is right now. And, it's had the effect of intimidating many people. And we've also seen many acts of serious crime taking place from one part of the country to another. You've got Jewish community centers in Fredericton and in Toronto and Montreal being firebombed or attacked. You've got Jewish schools being shot up, Jewish homes being shot up. You've got people calling for genocide against Zionists, which, Dr. King reminds us is really always just referring about Jews. So it's really, really bad. And I think not all of it is organic. As I've reported for Post Media, it looks very much like there is quite a bit of money and organization behind it. And, from all my years in politics, as you kind of get used to looking at a rally or a protest or an event, and you can tell if there's money or organization behind it. And it very much feels like that's the case here.
You mentioned that you hadn't, it has always sort of been around in the background, but it's now in the forefront, and people don't seem to be afraid to voice their opinion on that. Why do you think the change, or is it just it's more organized and there's more money?
I think there's a generational dimension to it. There's always been anti-Semites. There's always been Islamophobes and homophobes. Those people, regrettably, are always in society, but they're never in sufficient numbers to be kind of noteworthy or notable. They don't affect dramatic change. Two things have really taken place. Since 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, it's licensed a lot of haters to be out there in a very aggressive and loud way. And I think the second thing that's happened is generational, as I say. There were studies that were done almost immediately after October 7th by Harvard and by others showing that Generation Z, so 18 to kind of 25-year-olds, and millennials who are 25 to, their early 40s, are much more sympathetic, not just to the Palestinian cause, but to Hamas. Like, for example, Harvard, the week after October 7th, and when it was documented the terrible things that happened there, Harvard found that more than half of young Americans sympathized with Hamas, indicated that they were supportive of what Hamas did. And I've seen similar studies done in Canada by people that you and I both know, so serious pollsters, serious readers of public opinion, showing the same thing. So we've got a cultural problem, brought on by the Trump era, but I think we've got a generational problem too.
Do some people have trouble seeing Israel as able to defend itself? That seems to be part of the problem here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, Israel's always held to a different standard. If you look at what the Syrian regime did against Muslims in that country, murdering hundreds of thousands of innocent Muslim civilians, nary a peep was heard from the people we're now seeing protesting in the streets against Israel. I think Israelis that I know, and I've interviewed plenty in the past few weeks and months, they're used to that double standard. But it's been particularly hurtful to them because 1,200 men, women, children, and babies were slaughtered in Israel on October 7th, and not just Jews, foreign workers as well. And more than 200 were kidnapped, with more than 100 who are still being held hostage. So it's been a very painful episode for them. And I think they expected reasonably the world to say, we're with you. We support eliminating Hamas. We support bringing home the hostages. And the reverse has happened. It's just unleashed this fury of anti-Semitism. And it's a very dark time in our history, I would say.
Yeah, we've had a lot of protests and demonstrations across the country, pro-Palestinian. But in most cases, police haven't charged very many people, nor do they seem to want to get involved. Why do you think that is?
I think they're waiting for some political leadership. I asked that question of some leaders in Montreal just for the holidays, because Montreal's had terrible situation, the shooting up of the kids' schools and the firebombing of synagogues and community centers. And there have been no arrests. I mean, there was one imam who stood up in front of a protest of 20,000 people and called upon God to exterminate the Jews. And he's still walking the streets. So I think that, the police, I'm not giving them an excuse, but Valerie Plante in Montreal, Olivia Chow in Toronto to a lesser extent, the police need to see that the people who develop the policies and the laws are going to back them up if and when they they lay charges. And it's not every place, some jurisdictions like Ottawa, where you are right now, are doing quite well. So, in fact, there was a terrorist plot against Jews, an attack that was being planned against Jews by some young offenders, alleged young offenders, and the police caught it, and they prevented that from taking place. So, kudos to them. But in other parts of the country, the police are really asleep at the switch, and, we pay their salaries and we expect them to protect us, all of us, and they're not doing it.
You brought up the police and looking for political leadership. And you mentioned we're in Ottawa. And 2 years ago, the political leadership asked the police to do their jobs, but they didn't do it. So how do you reconcile that?
I think in Ottawa, they learned their lesson. They learned that if you let the bad guys do bad things, it gives them a license to do more bad things. There's a principle in law, and put on my lawyer's hat, called deterrence. And it happens at sentencing, but it also happens at the laying of charges to deter criminal behavior. And I think what the police and the authorities learned in Ottawa is if you give them an inch, they're going to take a yard. So you cannot do that. And so Ottawa has kind of, when you compare it to Toronto or Montreal in particular, has done quite well. And other jurisdictions have done well in dealing with anti-Semitic crime. For example, yesterday in London, the judge in the case of the Muslim family who were slaughtered on the street 2 years ago, he wouldn't even say the name of the offender in that case, but found that he had acted as a terrorist. I think that kind of tough application of justice needs to be happening now with respect to the Jewish community, because if you look at hate crime across Canada, it has exploded since October 7th, and overwhelmingly it targets Jewish Canadians, not any other group.
Warren, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks, my friend. Good seeing you.
Warren Kinsella is a political commentator and former special advisor to Prime Minister Chretien, as well as an author. More than 29,000 Palestinians have been killed since Israel retaliated against Hamas. More than 60,000 are injured, and right now there's no end in sight. Joe Adam George is a research analyst specializing in Middle East and South Asia affairs, and he's written on national security issues for the Macdonald Laurier Institute. He joins us now. And Joe, from your writing, It seems that you felt this type of attack was inevitable. Why is that?
Hi, good morning, Ed. A pleasure to be here today with you. Um, this this was a long-standing problem, Ed. As you know, this is firstly a conflict that was in the making for decades. In fact, we have seen that preceding to this conflict, there were three other wars that were fought between Israel and the state of Palestine, and also the neighboring states in the region. So I think there's a lot to unpack, with regard to the history of the conflict, which is simply impossible to do the show. But I just go to some of the, just the very key basics. In 1948, after the first war was fought, and then UNRWA, the UN agency, was created for Palestinian refugees. At that time, of course, the agency was created with a noble intention of making sure that the Palestinians were taken care for and the futures were secure. Unfortunately, along the way, it got politicized by neighboring Arab states, and as you can see in the news of late, UNRWA has been, up in the news for all the wrong reasons. And what we have now created, what was back then created for a noble cause, is now become purely malicious. You have, for decades, a group of refugees operating in Palestine, being radicalized to try and overthrow the state of Israel and cause trouble for the rest of the world. And as you can see, it's also become a problem for the neighboring Arab states, and which is why none of the Arab states want to take on Palestinian refugees, simply because they find these people to be quite problematic. There have been three recorded instances in history where Palestinians have been taken by Lebanon, by Jordan, and by Kuwait, and they were then kicked out of these countries because they caused trouble there. The most recent one, during the Gulf War in 1990, the Palestinians went and supported the Iraqi president Saddam Hussein to try and defeat the Kuwaitis. And so once Kuwait won the war with the help of the US coalition, they got rid of nearly 300,000 Palestinians. Similarly, and this was the same case in Jordan. They tried to assassinate the then King Hussein, the father of the present monarch, King Abdullah. And King Hussein then kicked them out. The same thing in Lebanon as well. They were the cause for the Lebanese civil war back in the mid-70s, and which, as a result of which, Lebanese Christians were forced to seek refuge in Western countries. So you can see that there is a lot of backstory to this conflict, which is doesn't make for easy reading, and it's unfortunately the Palestinians, as much as the Israelis are victims in this, the Palestinian people have also suffered for decades. And sadly, there is no magic bullet as such, a solution for this, so to speak, at this point in time.
No, and that's unfortunate. What concerns me in Canada is why police seem to be doing very little to break up these pro-Palestinian or anti-Semitic protests. Why do you think that is?
Good question, Ed. This again is a long-standing problem. This did not happen as a result of the conflict. It's purely political, and I would lay the blame on all forms of government, not just the Justin Trudeau government, but also the provincial ones as well. Because, as you know, policing is part of the provincial government's requisite as well. So, this problem firstly has been because Justin Trudeau has allowed has created a very toxic environment where where diaspora politics and appeasement politics are played. So when you try and show preference to certain communities over others, you are, and you are inevitably going to cause, havoc in the days to come, because when a conflict like this happens, then you can't base your policies on principle. You're forced to act on partisanship. So and as you know, Prime Minister Trudeau has always, with his foreign policy and even with his domestic policy, it's very unclear what he stands for. He tries to make everybody happy, and in the process, very few are actually made happy. So, and that's what we see with the conflict. There could be, I'm not sure why the police are failing to act on some very clear instances of anti-Semitism, clear cases of violence. I mean, you're seeing cases of synagogues being shot at, people being threatened, but very little is being done. On the other hand, if you were to see, certain favored communities being hurt, you'd see Prime Minister Trudeau lose no time to go to the media and talk about that attacks against that particular community is unacceptable and so on. But unfortunately, the Jewish community since October 7, for them it's been a very difficult time, and I would like to see all forms of government take more. Get the law enforcement agencies to be more serious in protecting our Jewish communities.
Yeah, in your reading or in your writing, you feel part of the problem in Canada is the transnational financial crime laws. How is that factoring in here?
Well, that again is a broader problem, Ed, and it's not limited to the conflict alone. As you can see, in the past, even before the conflict started, we knew that there was issues of foreign interference in Canada. As you know, there is an ongoing inquiry in that regard as well, with regard to the Iranian regime, China, the Chinese Communist Party, and many other rogue actors, involved in trying to meddle in our internal affairs. And as a result, and because our laws and our criminal laws rather are so backward, it's made it easy for criminals, even transnational ones, to look at Canada as a playground to conduct their malicious activities. I mean, you got Mexican drug cartels operating in Vancouver. Canada has now become not just a significant producer of fentanyl, but also an exporter as well. We have the issue of human trafficking, money laundering, and all of this is, emblematic of what our policies have been, and which really need to have a look in. But I don't expect the Trudeau government to solve any of these problems, since they, as you know, they seem to be focused on other issues and the scandals that they are currently caught in.
Joe, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ed. Pleasure being with you. Thank you.
Joe Adam George is a research analyst specializing in Middle East and Southeast affairs, and he's written on national security issues for the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Now, the war has brought some scary and hateful things to Canada. Richard Robinson's the Director of Research and Advocacy at B'nai B'rith Canada, and he joins us now. And Richard, your organization audits the number of anti-Semitic incidents in Canada. 2022 was a record-setting one. How is 2023 looking since October 7th?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Ed, to talk about this very important subject. Our numbers for 2023 are due to come out at some point in the spring, but I think it's safe to say that we are expecting to see a rise. in anti-Semitic incidents. It has been a very concerning year. It was a year that actually, people forget, saw two conflicts in the Middle East. There was a brief skirmish between what now seems to be a brief skirmish between Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in May of 2023, and that led to a rise in anti-Semitic incidents that actually lasted for several weeks following that, well into June. And then, of course, since October 7th, for lack of a better term, the wheels have just sort of fallen off, and daily we're receiving calls and uncovering new incidents of anti-Semitism.
How does that make you feel?
It's deeply concerning. Dare I even say horrifying to be a leader within the Jewish community at this point. It's highly troubling as a Canadian to know that a international conflict can have such severe domestic ramifications. The fact that a ally of Canada is fighting a defensive war, and yet it produces such caustic vitriol in Canadian cities across the country is concerning, Ed.
Yeah, when you look at this, Israel's being blamed for Palestinian deaths, but Hamas is the one who basically started everything. But they don't seem to be getting the brunt of the blame, at least through pro-Palestinian people. Why do you think that is?
Yes, sympathy and empathy for Israel were very short-lived. We saw, cities around the world lighting their monuments blue and white and issuing their condolences and their sympathies and standing in solidarity with Israel directly following October 7th. And then, unfortunately, as time has passed, that support seems to have simply disappeared. More so than attributing blame to Hamas for the ongoing conflict. And of course, Israel is fighting a defensive war, Ed. Hamas attacked Israel unilaterally with its allies on October 7th, and Israel's actions henceforth have been in response to the unprecedented terror attack that occurred on October 7th. But more than that, it's also important to look at the landscape that Hamas has created in Gaza since Israeli forces withdrew in the early 2000s. Hamas has ruled Gaza following a civil war against the other side in the Palestinian conflict, which was Fatah, and since then they've created a military infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, as is evidenced by the tunnels, as is evidenced by the military brigades, as is evidenced by the rockets. And this is not a democracy. And so people forget that people have been suffering in Gaza under Hamas's rule for decades now, Ed.
And a lot of use the Palestinians are human shields in this. There's no way Hamas would be able to hide its weapons and its tunnels without Palestinian knowledge. I personally, I've never been there, but I can't see how any of that's been developed without everyday Palestinians not knowing what's going on. What do you think?
That goes back to it not being a democracy. It goes far deeper than just using people as physical shields. These are people who have been indoctrinated. These are people who have been subjected to a brutal regime. Hamas cares not for anything but the furtherance of its own ideology. We've seen Hamas engage in assassinations of its enemies. We've seen Hamas engage in extrajudicial killings of its adversaries, of its own Palestinian people. So these are people that don't really have the opportunity to resist, Ed.
What concerns do you have about, and I'll call it a weak police effort to stop the violent protests and the anti-Semitism we've been seeing right across the country here?
It's the incitement, Ed. The longer these protests have gone on, the more that we've witnessed this incitement brewing in Canada, and it's starting to reach a fever pitch. We've seen, the targeting, the increasing targeting of Jewish businesses, of infrastructure with Jewish names attached to it, like Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, or even just yesterday, the Bronfman building at the Faculty of Management at McGill University. And something needs to give. We've seen the recent graffiti in Toronto where it was calling not just to harm Zionists, but for the assassination and murder of politicians. And it starts with one protest. It starts with a protest on October 9th with a Hamas flag at it, and now it's escalated months later to the open targeting of Jewish businesses and the calling for the assassination of Canadian leadership. So there's very liminal concern, Ed, that we're only going to see the continued de-evolution of the situation unless something is done.
From your perspective, has the federal government failed here? Or if not, how can it, or how should it address the current situation?
I think that there's been a failure at all levels of government, for the most part, to really address this. I mean, municipal governments could better use their bylaws to ensure that protests do not de-escalate into the hate fests that we are seeing. Provincial governments, for the most part, are responsible for the policing of these protests, and they could compel a stronger response. And of course, the federal government could look at updating the criminal code, could update it, could look into updating certain legislation to ensure that our hate crime provisions are adequate to protect our vulnerable citizens.
Richard, I want to thank you for joining us today. A very, very concerning situation.
Thank you very much for having me, Ed, and for addressing this situation.
Richard Robinson's the Director of Research and Advocacy at B'nai B'rith Canada. Our Unpublished Vote question asks, do you feel police in Canada are addressing the violence and anti-Semitism professionally? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at Unpublished Vote. I want to thank our guests today, Warren Kinsella, Joe Adam George, and Richard Robinson. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.